So when you see someone who's just been to their first symphony orchestra concert, you sometimes hear them asking, so where were the saxophones? Sax is one of the most popular instruments, you see them everywhere, so why aren't they part of the standard orchestral lineup? I was a bit shocked the other day when I came across a video here on YouTube that attempted to answer this question, and the reason they gave was that the saxophone doesn't blend with the other instruments. That the few uses it has in the orchestra are as a soloist, because otherwise it's too loud, it just sticks out too much, it just doesn't blend. Now this really quite annoyed me because in my view nothing could be further from the truth. The true reason the sax isn't a fully fledged member of the orchestra is a pretty amazing and somewhat depressing story in which basically the haters won. But before I get into that, I want to start by debunking the blending myth with a few examples of how well it does blend, alongside a few general examples of its unrivaled versatility as an instrument. Taken as a family, the saxophone really is one of the most versatile instruments of them all. Like the clarinet, it's capable of playing incredible pianissimos that disappear into silence, but it's also capable of tremendous volume that can match a brass instrument. The composer Hector Berlioz, who was an early supporter of the instrument, wrote, "It cries, sighs and dreams. It possesses a crescendo that can gradually diminish until it's only an echo of an echo. I know of no other instrument that possesses this particular capacity to reach the outer limits of audible sound." The soprano sax has an upper register that's close in tone to the oboe, but it can be both gentler and more penetrating there. The raucous sound of three soprano saxophones over a wash of brass and percussion is one of the most powerful effects in Birtwistle's The Mask of Orpheus. The tenor and the alto saxes blend tremendously with bassoon, with oboe, with the clarinet, with French horn, actually with pretty much any instrument you can think of. A whole family of saxes is capable of a tender and lyrical legato, as well as one of the shortest staccatos of any instrument, which is one reason why they're popular with the tight rhythms of minimalism. When the saxophone was first introduced, many of the finest musicians and composers were impressed specifically with its ability to blend. Rossini was introduced to the instrument in 1844 and declared, "The saxophone produced the finest blending of sound that I have met with." And as we'll see, the desire for blending was actually one of the main reasons it was invented in the first place. The man behind the new instrument was Adolphe Sax, a Belgian whose father was one of the country's leading instrument makers. By the time he was 6, Adolphe was already learning how to drill the body of a clarinet. While his father concentrated on retail sales, young Adolphe was given a free rein to experiment, and as he matured, he began to focus on what he saw as a problem with the existing orchestral setup: the lack of a well-balanced, blendable bass in the orchestral woodwinds. Sax was a talented clarinetist himself, and his first efforts went into completely overhauling the design of the bass clarinet. This is one area where his efforts were fully rewarded, and with only a few small adjustments, his design is still used by bass clarinetists throughout the world today. He also invented the contrabass clarinet, which, although far from commonplace, has increasingly started to find a home in recent years in orchestras playing new compositions. Sax felt that among the existing orchestral instruments, the bassoon didn't provide enough of a bridge to the brass section, and that the Ophicleide, which was a brass instrument with keys like a woodwind instrument, didn't possess enough dynamic range. The early sketches and patents for the saxophone suggest that Sax's concept simply transplanted the mouthpiece he'd developed for the bass clarinet onto the Ophicleide. The new instrument had the power to match the brass, but also the ability to play delicately and blend with the other woodwinds. Sax went on to develop a full family of instruments from the bass up to the soprano. Sax was clearly a brilliant and talented inventor, but he also had a rather brusque, arrogant manner, and he wasn't afraid to push his accomplishments, even if it meant getting on people's nerves. One of his favourite sales pitches was to request a competition between an existing or a rival instrument, and his own. In 1845, Sax moved to Paris, and in an attempt to become a key supplier to the French military, he found himself in front of an audience of 20,000 people in a full-scale battle of the bands with rival local manufacturers. And despite some behind-the-scenes pressure from his rivals, which led to several players from Sax's band not showing up, Sax's instruments were still judged to be the best. The victory should have been the final confirmation of the saxophone's arrival, but instead it marked the beginning of a bitter rivalry between Sax and the closed shop of French manufacturers who set out to destroy him any way they could. They embroiled him in countless lawsuits, and most damagingly for the instrument's future, they pressurized musicians not to use any of Sax's instruments. Donizetti, for example, had planned to include a bass clarinet in his opera Don Sebastian, but when the musicians threatened to walk out, he was forced to drop it. There were numerous similar stories regarding the saxophone, and in this way, an instrument that could have quickly established itself as a core part of the orchestra was effectively blocked from entry. So the classical saxophone became locked in a vicious cycle. Composers knew there would be difficulties if they wrote for the instrument, so they tended to stay away. Or if they did, they would often include alternative parts, as Bizet did in his La Lésienne, or write them as a solo within a single movement, so that the part could be doubled by someone else who played sax as a second instrument, which itself meant that the sax part didn't always get the performance it deserved. Meanwhile, the sax's use in marching bands thrived. In the 1870s, French bands with saxophones visited Boston, where bandleader Patrick Gilmore fell in love with them and introduced them to his own bands. By the time John Philip Sousa used them in the 1890s, saxophone fever had well and truly begun. But as the instrument grew more popular, with that came a certain vulgarity from groups like the Brown Brothers, who emphasised the comical aspects of the instrument. Over the years, the reputation of the saxophone plummeted, and the more it became used in jazz and popular music, the more classical musicians shunned it. One Juilliard professor, on learning his clarinet pupil also played the sax, said, "Don't you ever mention that instrument in class or I'll take that scholarship away from you." And as we heard at the start, this view of the sax as a loud, brash, vulgar instrument clearly persists in some quarters to this day. On the whole, though, the rise of a fine generation of new classical players and good teaching at some conservatoires means composers are far more interested in writing for the instrument than ever before. The problem now comes down to money. The orchestral setup has barely changed since the 19th century. That's a subject for a whole nother video. And so to add even one sax, let alone a whole section of four, as Adolphe Sax had originally envisioned, is something that only the most established composers can demand. It's a sad situation. You can't help but feel that the world has lost out on the inclusion of this versatile instrument into orchestral pieces over the past 100 years. It's hard not to ultimately lay blame on those Parisian instrument manufacturers who, instead of trying to compete fairly with Sax's invention, chose instead to block its progress into the wider world. So which orchestral pieces do you know that include sax, and which ones are your favourites? Let me know in the comments. And if you like this video, please do like, subscribe and share it with your friends. See you next time.